Dear God, help us breathe. Help us relax. Help us find a way forward. May these moments of thoughtful introspection and reflection give us firm land to stand on in this day and the days ahead. Amen. Now, if you'd studied American history in high school, and I imagine everyone has, you were inevitably introduced to a man with a very generic male name, John Brown. Remember him? He was that half-crazy abolitionist whose violence at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, sped up the coming of our Civil War. John Brown was a self-appointed liberator. His plan had been to free a group of slaves there at Harper's Ferry and thus supposedly to inspire thousands of others to revolt. Things went sour right away and he was arrested. He was written off by Northerners and Southerners alike as a terrorist kook until his trial, where he spoke so eloquently about the holy cause of liberation and the evils of slavery that even some Southerners began to take another look at the enterprise. Once he was convicted of murder, the whole nation watched as he went to the gallows. He proved to be as unflappable in death as he was at his trial. He rode to the gallows sitting on top of his own coffin, so serene that some said he looked to them like Moses, which is why he shows up in this sermon. He took a long look at the Blue Ridge Mountains and said, sitting on his coffin, remember, "This is beautiful country." The collection of men around him there was extraordinary. There was Colonel Robert E. Lee, who would be offered the leadership of the Union forces by Abraham Lincoln a few years hence and would turn it down because though he was all for the Union, he could not imagine taking up arms against his fellow Virginians. Lee was there at Harper's Ferry to keep order and to resist any who might come in to rescue the old prophet John Brown. Also there was Major Thomas Jackson, professor at Virginia Military Institute, who would later be called Stonewall. John Wilkes Booth was there too. He was an actor who assured himself a good view of the festivities by volunteering as a Virginia militiaman. And though zealously pro-slave, Booth called John Brown, quote, "a brave old man, the greatest character of this century." There was a sense in John Brown's sublime resignation that he felt he had accomplished something. He had done the work he had been born to do and harbored no regrets. In this way, he resembled the man Moses. You remember that Moses, too, killed a man in order to free slaves, Hebrew ones. That was early on in his journey when he was an Egyptian prince, or so the story goes. After learning that he'd been found out, Moses runs out into the wilderness where he expects to spend the rest of his long life in hiding, posing as a humble shepherd. But as we learn in the ancient narrative, God has other plans for him. Well, let me ask you, is it an example of mercy or cruelty that God takes Moses up a mountain to give him this expansive view of the new promised land? "I have let you see it with your own eyes," says God, "but you shall not cross over there." What's up with that? Tradition has it that God was punishing Moses because of his presumption in striking a rock with a magical wand in order to obtain water, but that seems preposterous on pretty much every level to me. How about a simple reason? Moses doesn't accompany his people into the land of the promise because the purpose of his life is complete. And look, there's this grand serenity to him when he gives the people a final blessing. The job of subduing the promised land will be a whole new struggle. Sometimes a new project like that is best taken up by a new generation. There comes a time when the torch needs to be passed. Moses is the great liberator, but Joshua is the closer. He's the one the Hebrew people need when it comes to moving into the new land. And as the narrative turns, God chooses him for that work. Well, Moses again. The German poet Rilke draws an awesome picture of the final scene in Moses' life, imagining the circumstances of his death at the hands of a male version of God. Here's how Rilke writes it. None of them were willing to take his life. Just the dark, defeated angel choosing a weapon. He cruelly approached the commanded one, Moses, but even he went clanging backward, upward, and screaming into the heavens, I can't. For through the thicket of his brows, Moses had patiently noticed him and gone on writing words of blessing and the infinite name. And his eyes were clear right to the bottom of his powers. So the Lord, dragging half of the heavens behind him, came hurling down in person and made a bed up from a bed in the mountain, laid the old man out. From its orderly dwelling he summoned the soul and spoke of much that they had shared in the course of an immeasurable friendship. But finally, the soul of Moses was satisfied, admitted enough had been done. It was finished. Then the old God slowly lowered down over the old man, his ancient face above him, and drew him out with a kiss. Well, how does one best take the measure of one's own life? Its end, its middle, and then how does one's attitude about that dictate how one lives every day? Years before, Moses had prayed to God in the desert to feed the liberated people because they were starving, remember? God's delivered them something called manna from the sky, but only enough for one day. Each day, this food, like soda bread, was given fresh. Some of the people, not trusting that it would be given again the next morning, gathered baskets of it in order to store it up against the morrow. But it quickly spoiled. The message being that people will inevitably try to control their own future. But too often, it only ends up a rotting mess, right? God was apparently teaching them about living one day at a time, which is why Jesus said, give us this day our daily bread. How strange that sounds today to us with our insurance policies, our IRAs and our 10-year warranties on some of our automobiles. Many baby boomers are turning into hoarders, thinking that as long as they have a full stockpile of stuff, they'll live long enough to use it all. They'll never die. Well, there's a funny thing about our relationship to our possessions, right? We become different people as time plods on. We hardly notice the change in ourselves until we sense that things we long ago stored up don't look to us the same anymore. You know what I mean, don't you? Years on, we look at these things, old books we bought but haven't read, fabric we never sewed, tile we never installed, and often we wonder, who bought this stuff? It's a funny business. Tim Page, a fine editor, has written about this insightfully. He says, as a young man, I became enamored of the American author Don Powell, whose life and works I absorbed in much the same manner I absorbed the World Book Encyclopedia as a child. And I spent 5 years editing her novels, short stories, plays, diaries, and letters, and writing her first biography. 5 years. I look back on these projects with a certain mystified satisfaction. I'm glad they were done, but it's as though they had been accomplished by somebody else. For the particular furies and fevers that impelled them have long since evaporated in me. Do you remember some things you once did that now seem like they were done by some stranger? Even good things? Life is like that for everybody. Everything has a shelf life. Even the projects we get the most excited about. We wish life would just hold still, but it doesn't. Until the day he died, people asked John Lennon this question: when are the Beatles going to get back together? And he would answer them with this signature sarcasm saying, when are you going back to high school? Because he knew that everything has a sell-by date, even the Beatles. Not the Rolling Stones, apparently. No, but the Beatles. Most things. On the other hand, few people ever accomplish everything they want to, no matter how committed they are or how long they have to work. Part of coming to terms with life is coming to terms with its loose ends, right? Sometimes we're called upon to give up dreams that we've nursed for years, even decades. I wonder if perhaps, in fact, the journey to the promised land was, in a way, the destination for Moses, not the getting there. Not the getting there. That was clearly what he was called for, the getting ready. That was what he had been created to do, even with its struggle, wrestling with a stiff-necked people and a very demanding God. That all was Moses' portion in life and no more. Martin Luther King Jr. confronted that himself and said so when on the night before he died, he told the congregation gathered in Memphis that he had been to the mountaintop and he had looked over and he had seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, he said. And so it was. Many people's lives amount to doing important work while being stuck between conflicting forces. Can you relate? For decades, I flirted with the idea of becoming a college or seminary professor. Early on, I'd gotten an MA in English and figured one day I'd do the PhD, but one thing after another interfered. I've loved being a pastor, but I have an aversion to leaving big things like that unfinished. I was thinking seriously of finishing that course of study up until about 15 years ago, but deep inside, I think I knew that it just wasn't for me. The field had changed so much since I was in college. Finally, I realized that what I wanted was not to be a professor who talked about literature. What I wanted more than anything was to write it myself. And once I invested myself in writing, well, I felt like I was lucky to find my true path and dodge the counterfeit. But it had taken me an awfully long time to bury the body of that old, obsolete dream. And this kind of thing happens to lots and lots of people. What have you accomplished in your life? Is there more to be done? Is it yours to do? Or is it best left to others? Or do you know? Or should you know? Looking back, what thing were you once fully committed to and because of some circumstance found yourself excluded from in some way? An engagement that went south, maybe? A career that never materialized? A dream job that went to somebody else? A degree, a a certification, a graduate program you didn't finish, a musical instrument you wanted to master but just didn't happen. Is there a God place in any of that for you? Can you possibly say, I dodged a bullet there, or I'm a better person because that didn't happen, or I'm a different person because that didn't happen, and it's okay? If you had a choice, would you want to go back and try again? Well, that all sums up my attempt to make this ancient text relevant to us moderns. But I don't want to end this without underlining how amazingly poignant the end of the Moses story is. Because Joseph Campbell would tell us, it's the myth of the hero who doesn't live to see the promised land he's led people to. And that is iconic with a capital I. So with that in mind, allow me to end with the following. For the last couple of months, I've been suffering from extreme election anxiety. By your nervous laughter, I think a number of you have felt the same. Every day I read Heather Cox Richardson's daily blog, but I stay away from looking at the polls. They just jerk my heart around no end. I don't watch Hallmark holiday specials in order to detract me, or distract me, or sitcoms. That's not my style. The thing that has fed my soul most recently is the Russian dissident Alexei Navalny's posthumous memoir, Patriot. And whether the election turns out as I hope or not, Navalny's parting gift to us, his final wisdom, is good guidance and a source of hope. Let me hurry on to say this is not exactly inspirational reading. Navalny is dealing with the same intuition Moses felt concerning his imminent mortality. The sneaking suspicion he has that while he is a leader of people, he may be on this earth only to give his people hope and point them in the right direction, not deliver them into a fully realized democratic Russia. Remember, Alex Navalny is writing from prison, where he knows his life can be snuffed out at any moment. Here are a few paragraphs from him about how he coped with that possibility. Here, he says, is a technique I worked out. Perhaps others may find it helpful in the future. It is frequently to be found in self-help books. So here it is. Imagine the worst thing that can happen and accept it. This works even if it's a masochistic exercise, he says. It's a fairly easy exercise because it involves a skill everyone developed in childhood. You may remember crying your eyes out in your bed and exultantly imagining you are going to die right then and there, just to spite everyone. Imagine the look on the faces of your parents, how they will cry when it finally dawns on them who they have lost. Choked with tears, they'll beg you as you lie quiet and still in your little coffin to get up and come and watch TV, not just until 10 o'clock, but until 11. If only you would be alive. But it is too late, you are dead, which means you are unrelenting and deaf to their pleas. Well, Navalny says, mine is much the same idea. Get into your prison bunk and wait to hear lights out. The lights are switched off. You invite yourself to imagine as realistically as possible the worst thing that could happen. And then, as I said, accept it, skipping the stages of denial, anger, and bargaining. Taking his own advice, Alexei Navalny says, "I will spend the rest of my life in prison and die here. There will not be anybody to say goodbye to. Or while I am still in prison, people I know outside will die, and I won't be able to say goodbye to them. I will miss graduation from school and college. Tasseled mortarboards will be tossed in the air in my absence. All anniversaries will be celebrated without me. I'll never see my grandchildren. I won't be the subject of any family stories. I'll be missing from all the photos." He goes on. "You need to think about this," he says, "seriously, and your cruel imagination will whisk you through your fears so swiftly that you will arrive at, quote, eyes filled with tears, that destination in next to no time. The important thing is not to torment yourself with anger, hatred, fantasies of revenge, but to move instantly to acceptance. That can be hard. Instead of yelling, you need to think about the situation calmly. So what if that comes to pass? Worse things happen. I'm 45, he says. I have a family and children. I've had a life to live, worked on some interesting things, done some things that were useful, but there's a war on right now in Ukraine. Suppose a 19-year-old is riding in an armored vehicle. He gets a piece of shrapnel in his head, and that's it. He has had no family, no children, no life. I made my choices, but these people were just beginning their lives," he says. I'll close now with one little piece of wisdom from Alexei Navalny that I most take to heart in these very stressful days. Maybe I like this so much because I heard former Representative Liz Cheney once say nearly the same thing. Everything will be all right. And even if it won't be, we'll have the consolation of having lived honest lives.